So if you've watched my last video, you'll know I did my senior thesis on Thomas the Tank Engine and its journey as a franchise, as well as the legacy its fans have kept alive. Well, the other portion of that paper was looking at how Thomas appealed to these fans by asking the question, why do we anthropomorphize things in the first place? And looking at some of the psychology around that. I believe Thomas has a rather unique take on the anthropomorphizing vehicles concept, because it takes place in a world practically based on our own. This is especially apparent in the books, where you'll see many appearances made by real-life engines like the Flying Scotsman or Stepney the Bluebell engine, to name the most famous examples, whereas this concept is slightly different in other stories and franchises such as Bluey, Cars, Zootopia, who create worlds pretty much parallel to our own, but are only inhabited by anthropomorphized things. Thomas is more akin to, Toy Story or Oliver's Company, and yet Thomas's world still has the characters exist openly, not in secret. On a personal note, I think another aspect of what makes Thomas's concept so unique is that steam engines are such a natural choice to personify. I mean, not as natural as animals per se, but as far as inanimate things go, I would say, and lends well to their personification. I think there are a few examples of the steam engine itself that help to relate to them. For example, coal and water as their fuel sources, similar to how we need to eat or drink, especially when they have to exert themselves pulling heavy goods or going up big hills and feeling refreshed when they get to a water tower. Also, the engines residing in a roundhouse or other sheds that can act as their own little houses or beds, the latter being more apt as the show has the characters sleep there after a day's work. The third trait I really think connects it for me, and maybe this will sound like a reach for you, is the steam they produce being a kind of breathing. Alright, hear me out. The hissing that engines make after a long journey is like a sigh of release, just so full of character, and the iconic chuffing sounds, while certainly mechanical in nature, are just like breathing sounds to me.
"Now," said his driver. Duke puffed and roared as though he was pushing the whole train's weight before him. The noise echoed everywhere. When they reached the last station, everyone cheered.
This really brings them to life for me. And of course, this is all just my opinion, but I think this is one of the most important parts that contribute to the appeal of the very idea of Thomas and his world. But whether you agree on that being the appeal, there's no denying that this is what we do as humans. We project ourselves, or at least familiar qualities, into inanimate objects and just imagine. We anthropomorphize. As for why, there's no definite answer. However, from what I understand, and as Gabriella Airenti says in their paper, humans frequently use fantasy to go beyond sheer facts and include simple objects or images in narrative contexts, which makes them appear more appealing and meaningful, and attention-grabbing, as Pascal Boyer would say. From what I've read, anthropomorphizing goes back to human beginnings, especially when it comes to religion or belief systems. Some examples include Aeolus, the Greek god of wind, who is sometimes depicted as a cloud, or pieces of art depicting therianthropes, human-animal hybrids, such as the Leuwenmensch, a man with a lion's head. Also, it would seem when looking up the word therianthrope, Google finds it important to distinguish them from furries, so I guess I can't make a joke about being the first citing of furry culture. Anyways, all of these tell us that we as humans have some fascination with personifying things to various extents, whether it be more organic things like animals or inanimate objects like clouds. As Stuart Guthrie gets at in his book Faces in the Clouds, A New Theory of Religion, we tend to anthropomorphize things differently. Like in any Disney movie you've ever watched, let's use Zootopia as the most prominent example. You'll usually see animals doing almost everything a human does in society and physicality, etc., etc. But in Thomas, it's not only harder to do that physically, but it would require a lot more suspension of disbelief. I mean, look at Cars. Make no mistake, though, I think Thomas's world still works as a fantasy because it never really pushes you to wonder about all that all the logistics, and instead focuses on entertaining stories through an appealing concept. This drives me to my central point here, that Thomas, and by which I mean the classic series mostly, has attracted people so much because of its attention-grabbing premise of talking engines, while still setting and following rules that are close, if not identical, to reality. When watching the original show and reading the original books, the island of Sodor functions as a fictional railway, but not because of how it operates. The author Wilbur Awdry was a man who loved railways, so he was able to channel that passion into this world and tell stories that utilize the workings of actual railways and their many facets. One article written by Hifza Javed suggests that children with ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, are drawn to Thomas the Tank Engine for a variety of reasons that have to do with the fact that the characters are themselves engines, which entails features like the spinning wheels or intricate details that are satisfying, as well as other adjacent traits like schedules or railway tracks that add predictability, traits that are unique to railways. The paper puts forth that Thomas can act as a comfort character with children for ASD because of these attributes and through the ubiquity of these characters in various forms, like toys and merchandise, which creates a feeling of familiarity. I'd also like to add that some findings suggest that more fantastical shows that defy reality, like Chuggington, can affect children's expectations in life to some extent. You know, when they see the engines bouncing or flying around, it makes it harder to connect to that world because it's so fantastical. Now, there is the argument of, theatrical, more exaggerated, heightened reality versus a more realistic approach. But I think that's different from what I mean here, which is that there's a complete dissonance of the concept of Thomas and his world versus how it's being shown. So how I interpret this is that although the premise is certainly fantastical, in that the engines have faces and talk, they don't act at sight how you expect an engine to act physically, like in movement, which I find is particularly noteworthy in the show because they use real models that adhere to physics and real movement. And while there appears to be no concrete evidence for any benefits to anthropomorphizing inanimate objects like trains or cars, like to help learn morals or understand the world better, it is certainly a natural tendency among children and adults. And I think this is something we like to do for entertainment's sake. I like to think of how Awdry himself described where he got this idea for the first story, Edward and Gordon.
When I was small, I lived in Box. And there's a gradient there between Box and Caution. And at night, lying in bed, I'd hear a goods train draw up at Box Station and crow for the banker. Beep, beep, beep. Then the banker would come out of the shed, buffer up behind, and crow, beep, beep, beep. And then you'd hear the train starting. I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And the banker would come up behind, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can.
I think it's such a simple idea. It just exemplifies what we do as humans. You know when you try to imagine what two dogs are trying to say to each other? Or when you see a face on the front of a car? You don't do anything to change the reality of what you're looking at, but you're still making up stories for them. This is what I think separates Thomas from things like Zootopia or Cars, where they inhabit their own separate realities, or Toy Story and The Brave Little Toaster, where they're hidden and goes on when we're not around. It takes what really does happen in our world, like trains being late or accidents, and it builds a plot and its characters around them. As Yunpeng Tang suggests in their paper about art therapy, it is when children are immersed in a plot and characters, it helps them to perform their own stories. Something that the Thomas community has been doing for decades now, something I talked more about in my previous video. But this is why I enjoy talking about this franchise, because there's so much to discuss, and each part has so many layers to it. So I hope Mattel or whoever is running the show at the moment can see the work that fans continue to create today, and maybe the broader public image of Thomas can be that of more respect, or I don't know, maybe just appreciation for what it was. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.